Welcome to UpSkill Fundamentals, the NDIS and people with complex disability. My name's Penny Pohl and I'm the Summer Foundation's Senior Policy and Research Officer. I'm rolling out UpSkill, an initiative of the Summer Foundation to build the capability of the NDIS support coordination and allied health workforce. I would like to acknowledge that we are all on the land of traditional owners. I would like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and any elders who may be here with us today. Today's webinar is an introduction to working with people with complex disability support needs. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about the Summer Foundation. Formed in 2006 by Dr. Di Winkler, the mission of the Summer Foundation is to stop people being forced to go into residential aged care because there's no more appropriate housing and support model available to them. And the work undertaken by the Summer Foundation has a number of components. We have partnerships with university and we're producing peer-reviewed literature through research projects. We do storytelling, so we work with people who do have complex disabilities, who've exited aged care, who've perhaps moved into living on their own in a new SDA environment, and we track their progress and provide stories for decision makers and for other NDIS participants to see what's possible under the scheme. We have a policy team and we influence decision makers at all levels of government, housing, health, aged care. We do capacity building, so this is one area of the Summer Foundation's capacity building work. We're trying to build the capacity of the NDIS workforce, and we do prototypes. For example, in around 2016, we built 10 high physical supports in the Hunter region of New South Wales, and people transitioned into those apartments, and then we've done studies on how they've progressed and how their life has changed in those apartments. And we've made all that available material and all our learnings available to this sector, and other people have followed that model, and we're gradually building an SDA market. So this webinar today is a way of sharing what we've learned at Summer Foundation across all our different teams with you, NDIS practitioners, and we really hope that it brings together our learnings and builds your skills to get great outcomes for people with complex support needs. Throughout the ages, across most religions and cultures, having a child with a disability was understood as evidence of their parents' moral failing. So people who had children with disability felt very shamed by that, and I think elements of that have lingered on and they're still very prevalent in some cultural groups today. But we've always had another group of people with disability, and that's people who acquire a disability. And that was incredibly common before we had modern medicine. Workplace accidents would routinely result in amputation. We had lots of pandemics, smallpox, typhus, TB, leprosy. I mean, the list goes on and on, measles and the outcomes of that. So before we had vaccinations, modern medicine, antibiotics, seeing people with disabilities was incredibly common. But with the emergence of modern medicine coincided with industrialisation, and with industrialisation came a sort of notion of conformity. So people who were different were increasingly seen as outcasts. And that persists today, I think. In the middle of the 20th century, we saw the emergence of disability rights, a movement that builds on the principles and logic of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So at the moment, there's a tension between the medical model of disability, and the medical model of disability sees disability as a health condition to be dealt with by medical professionals. People with disability are thought to be different to what is normal, so they're abnormal. Disability is seen to be a problem that's located in the person. And from the medical model, a person with disability is in need of being fixed or cured. From this point of view, and the logic of this point of view is that disability is a personal tragedy and that people with disability are to be pitied. The medical model of disability is about what the person cannot do and who the person cannot be. Disability rights, on the other hand, really championed a social model of disability. So in the mid-20th century, the social model was promoted, and it sees disability as a result of the interaction between people living with impairment and the environment. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a milestone document. and as a common standard of achievements for all people of all nations. It sets out for the first time the fundamental human rights to be universally protected, and it's been translated into over 500 languages. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of political, jurisdictional or international status of the country or territory where a person belongs, whether it be independent trust, non-self-governing or under any other limitation of sovereignty. In summary, the human rights are that we're all born free and equal, don't discriminate, the right to life, no slavery, no torture. You have rights no matter where you go, you're all equal before the law. Your human rights are protected by law, no unfair detainment, the right to trial, we're always innocent until proven guilty, the right to privacy, freedom to move, the right to seek a safe place to live, the right to nationality, marriage and family, the right to own your own things, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, the right to public assembly, the right to democracy, the right to social security, workers' rights, the right to play, food and shelter for all, the right to education, copyright, a fair and free world, responsibility. We have a duty to other people and we should protect their rights and freedoms, and no one can take away your human rights. So in Australia, we had a National Disability Strategy from 2010 to 2020, and it sets out 6 priority areas for action, including inclusive and accessible communities, rights protection, economic security, personal and community support, learning and skills, and health and well-being. The Productivity Commission was asked to review the state-based disability support system and design a new support system to provide personal and community supports to people with a disability. So that's only one of the 6 areas under the National Disability Strategy. And in 2008, Bruce Bonner-Haedy and Helena Sykes reported, the time is right to reform the disability sector, to shift from the current crisis-driven welfare system to a planned, fully funded national disability insurance scheme that will underwrite sustained, significant long-term improvements in meeting the needs of people with disabilities and their families. The Productivity Commission came back in 2011 with their report, and they found the current disability support system is unfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient. It gives people with a disability little choice, no certainty to access to appropriate supports, and little scope to participate in the community. People with disabilities and their carers, service providers, workers in the industry and governments all want change. And from there, Every Australian Counts was born, an enormous grassroots social change movement that lobbied really hard for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It lobbied communities, it brought people with disabilities and their families together. It sought consultation with all levels of government. And by March 2013, 79% of the Australian population surveyed reported that they were in favour of a National Disability Insurance Scheme. And on the 28th of March 2013, the Act passed the Australian Parliament. So what are the central ideas that underpin this landmark reform? The National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS as I'll refer to it now, was developed, or the legislation was developed from the blueprint provided by the Productivity Commission report. It passed on Parliament on the 28th of March 2013, and the Act itself forms the National Disability Insurance Agency, the NDIA, and the single goal of the NDIA is to implement the Act. There's also in its governance structure an independent advisory council to the NDIS, so they're people with disabilities who provide advice on the running and implementation, the running of the NDIA and the implementation of the NDIS. The NDIS began in various trial sites across Australia in July 2013, and the Productivity Commission modelled that by full rollout there'd be 460,000 participants in the scheme across Australia. And it's really interesting because it's actually a doubling of funding to people with disability. So what happened is all the states and territories between them were spending $11 billion a year in the state-based disability system, and the federal government took that 11 billion and doubled it. So they're contributing 11 billion as well. So we're now spending around $22 billion a year providing social and personal supports to people with a disability to participate more fully in the community. And that's around 1% of Australia's GDP. I want to draw your attention to the material published by the Independent Advisory Council, because they've got some wonderful resources on the NDIS and they've thought their way through some of the ethical issues for the scheme. This can be really terrific material to take to planning meetings. So become familiar with this site and have a look at their resources regularly. So the ones that I really think are worth being across are capacity building for people with disability, their family and carers, an issues paper about the NDIS and people with mental health issues, promoting independence for people with disabilities, reasonable and necessary support for families, choice and control, and there's another one which I'll come back to later, which is an ordinary life across the lifespan. So the NDIS Act, what does it do? Well, it's a codification of our obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Australia signed on to that convention in 2008, but it wasn't until 2013 that we actually codified our obligations with the NDIS Act. It provides individualised funding to support people's social and economic participation. It's underpinned by insurance principles, which is a really important departure from the state-based system. So, for example, in the old system, you may never have got a hospital bed because that's a very costly capital item, but under the NDIS, it's quite likely that you could have a hospital bed prescribed for someone and get it, because it may well reduce the number of support hours that that person needs over their life course. Because this is actually, the scheme is providing support to people over their life course, and so any technology or support that can reduce their person-to-person supports or maximise their independence is worth funding under the NDIS. Supports are national, that means they're portable, and we've never had this before. So you can be living in Tasmania and come to Victoria for a job, you bring your plan with you and you can set up services for yourself in Victoria. Governments all across Australia are exiting disability service provision, and what we're seeing is the emergence of a disability market. So in that market, people with disabilities are thought of as consumers, and they have money in their plans to go out and look for the services that suit them in the evolving disability marketplace. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the objects and principles of the NDIS Act, because it's quite likely that the planners that you're working with are not familiar with the Act itself. And planners sort of get things dumbed down for them, and they get task cards, and they might not have ever gone back to the source. But as a disability advocate or someone really working to ensure the rights and choice and control of people with disabilities, I think it's really incumbent that you have a working knowledge of the legislation itself. So under Part 2, Objects and Principles of the NDIS Act, it says, the objects of this Act are to A, in conjunction with other laws, give effect to Australia's obligations under the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability. And, you know, that's a really fundamental thing, because planners might say that's out of scope or we don't fund that. And it's really critical that you can actually say, well, this is perfectly reasonable under the Convention of the Rights with People with Disabilities, and this Act, the NDIS, is designed to give effect to our rights and obligations under that Act. So it doesn't hurt to be pretty conversant in this legislation. I think some other really interesting things are principles relating to the participation of people with disability. People with a disability are assumed, as far as reasonable in the circumstances, to have capacity to determine their own best interests and make decisions that affect their own lives. People with a disability will be supported in their dealings and communications with the agency so that their capacity to exercise choice and control is maximised. I think it's really important that we make sure that the agency and your interactions with the agency uphold that principle. So it's really important to be aware that that is a fundamental principle. So for example, if a planning meeting is planned, there's been no expectation that they'll be involved in a planning meeting, it's perfectly reasonable to stop the planning meeting. Or if someone's has a verbal communication issue and can't partake in the planning meeting that's been set up for them, it's perfectly reasonable to stop that planning meeting and request a planning meeting at a later date and provide the agency with details on what would allow the person to participate to the fullest extent possible. But basically, if someone has an impairment and it restricts their day-to-day function and it's likely to be permanent, then they're most probably eligible for the NDIS, and certainly they should be testing their eligibility if they think the supports would help them maximise their social and community and economic participation. However, there are residency requirements. So first off, the person has to reside in Australia, they have to be a permanent resident or an Australian citizen or a holder of a permanent visa. There are a couple of extra visa categories, so make sure you look into that if you're working with people who are not permanent Australian residents. So as I indicated, you may be working with someone who doesn't have one of the listed disabilities, but basically a person meets the disability requirements if a person has a disability that's attributable to one or more intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory or physical impairments, or to one or more impairments attributable to a psychiatric condition. The impairments are or are likely to be permanent, and the impairment or impairments result in substantially reduced function, capacity to undertake psychosocial functioning in undertaking one or more of the following activities: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care and self-management. And the impairment affects the person's capacity for social or economic participation, and the person is likely to require support under the National Disability Insurance Scheme for their lifetime. So there's also some opportunities for a person to cease to be a participant in the NDIS, and I think from the point of view of Summer, it's really important that you're clear about this. A person ceases to be a participant in the National Disability Insurance Scheme when they die or when they enter a residential aged care service on a permanent basis after they're 65 years of age. So if you're working with someone who's got complex disability support needs, is over 65 and is looking to go into residential aged care, that will forfeit their rights to continue to receive supports from the NDIS. On the other hand, if they go into residential aged care before they reach 65, if they choose to, they can continue to receive their NDIS supports in the residential aged care setting. That's a really important and complex distinction. So please think about it. Key principles of the NDIS. So it's goal-driven individualised funding, and people are funded via a unique and individual plan. People with disability choose their providers and they have control over the way their services are delivered. This results in a substantial shift away from the way that disability was done under the state and territory systems. There we had what's called block funding. So in that sense, we had a very service-centric provision of disability supports. For example, people living in group homes reported that they were essentially living in someone else's workplace. They weren't living in their own home. And under the marketisation of disability services, we're seeing people with disability become consumers and they enter into service agreements with providers. And that is how they specify how they want their services delivered, and they come to an agreement with a provider who can provide their supports in a way that best suits them and maximises their independence. So we're seeing a shift over time of power and control from service providers to people with a disability under this scheme. So that's all very well, but choice and control is not such a simple thing to enact. Choice and control has many inhibitors, and some of those are things that chronically affect people with disability. So some of the ones that I just think of off the top of my head are lack of money, a lack of experience of what's possible, a lack of expectations, a lack of self-confidence, and there's many others that I'm sure you can think of and that you encounter in your day-to-day work. And that, I think, goes back to the history of people with disability and how they've been treated throughout time. So on a more positive note, what might be some of the enablers of choice and control? So access to information, knowledge and experience about the choices and options that people have, peer support and learning from others, power over the resources and the relationships, the opportunity to think and dream about alternatives to their current life and their current reality, and support to make decisions from trusted others. So you've probably heard a lot of people described or communities described as hard to reach. Well, I think about the NDIS as a hard to reach service. Navigating the NDIS requires literacy. It requires digital literacy. It requires digital access. It requires that you understand the eligibility criteria and what's possible, the supports that you can access under the scheme. It requires knowledge about how the scheme works, what it will and won't fund. And it really relies on the ability to act as an informed consumer in an evolving and emerging marketplace. And finally, the capacity to enter into and enact service agreements. So that's a pretty high bar for a scheme where I think maybe up to 70% are coming into it with some form of intellectual or cognitive impairment. That's why the role of support coordinators is so important. So given that it's can be thought of as a hard to reach service, I was interested to read the quarterly report that came out on data from the 30th of March this year. So we saw 7.7% of participants who received a plan in the last quarter identified as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, 11.3% identified as coming from a coal background, and about 1.9% of people were from remote or very remote regions in Australia. So the scheme is starting to pick up some traction in those areas, but certainly we have such a long way to go until the number of people or the percentage of people in the scheme represents the percentage of people from those communities who actually have a disability. So if you're working with people whose first language is not English, people from cold communities, I really implore you to get onto the Centre for Culture, Ethnicity and Health website. They've got some really wonderful resources, including a health translated information, and they've got a whole host of resources around the NDIS that have been translated into hundreds of community languages. And that is your one-stop shop in terms of promoting people's choice and control by giving them information that's accessible to them. If you're working with people who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, I suggest you make yourself familiar with your relevant state or territory NACCHO, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, which is a living embodiment of Aboriginal aspirations and communities in their struggle for self-determination, particularly around their health, but they also are getting into disability. And then there is the First Peoples Disability Network Australia. So they've also got some terrific materials on their sites, and both of those organisations offer cultural sensitivity training. If you are working with people who are, well, even if you're not, I think it's really incumbent on support coordinators and allied health professionals to ensure that they do have the skills to work across cultures and to refer people back to their communities where relevant, so that they can work with people who really understand their worldview, their life frame, and can work from people from that with their own communities if that's their choice. So as I mentioned before, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and the NDIS Act itself assumes that people have capacity to make decisions that affect their own lives. In conjunction with that assumption, the disability scheme has some safeguards. So it has the provision for people to have plan nominees, that is people who can accept correspondence from the agency on their behalf. It's got NDIS nominees, and they are people who can really make decisions and work with the agency on their behalf. Each state and territory in Australia has a public guardian, and each guardianship regime works a little bit differently with the NDIS. So have a look in your state and territory guardianship website and get familiar with the interaction between public guardians and the NDIS. And be aware that there are supports that people can get funded in their plans to support them to make decisions for themselves.